Kia ora koutou, ko Joe Drayton, toko ingoa. I am a board member of Same But Different, and it's my absolute pleasure today to welcome you to our 2022 festival. Before we begin, I would really like to thank our sponsors. I want to start by a huge shout out for Creative New Zealand. I think Creative New Zealand has single-handedly at times held New Zealand culture up against the COVID tsunami of closure and cancellations. So thank you, Creative New Zealand, for all that you've done, but especially for Same. Also, the Peter Rule Foundation have continued to support us, Unity Books, the Rainbow New Zealand Charitable Trust, the Coalition for Books, and Auckland Pride. We thank you all for your contributions and your sustained support. It is due to your sponsorship that we can bring you our audiences today these free events celebrating LGBTQI plus writers from Aotearoa. And now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to our chair, Chris Tse, and I'd like you to enjoy the wonders of this fantastic panel, which is by ourselves, for ourselves. And here we go. Yours, take it away.
Thank you, Joe. Kia ora tātou, ko Chris Tse toko ingoa. I'm a poet and editor living in Wellington, and I'll be your chair for your session today. Welcome to this Same But Different session by ourselves, for ourselves. Although we can't be together in person, the silver lining of being online means that we do have an audience from throughout Aotearoa, so welcome to everybody tuning in today. We also have the technology that allows you to share your own thoughts and interact with other audience members, so please, some of you are already using the chat function. There's also a Q&A function to submit questions, which we'll try and get to before we wrap up this afternoon. We don't have much time together. Today, I'm joined by four incredible writers: Rebecca K Reilly, Rose Liu, Sam Te Kani, and Takunda Muzondiwa. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves individually in a moment. But before we do that, I thought I'd just quickly outline the focus of this session, which will be a discussion about identity, specifically the multiple identities that we all inhabit and express in different ways, and how that affects how we are perceived by others. So our individual cultural, gender, and sexuality identities are sometimes seen or expressed together, sometimes separately, and sometimes at odds with each other. So I'll be asking the writers today how this intersectionality has impacted on their lives and their writing. So now I'll pass the virtual microphone on to the writers to introduce themselves, starting with Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca K Reilly. I'm a novelist. I watched one of these panels yesterday and everyone was like holding up their book, but I don't have mine. Ko Ngāti Hine, Ngāti Wai. Oh, there we go. Toku iwi. Yeah, that's it.
Where's Rose gone?
She's on the entrance.
I didn't realize that was the thing we had to prepare. Oh, great. Chris is already on it. Kia ora, I'm Rose. I am from Poneke. I've lived here for like 8 years now. I am a writer. I wrote a book of essay collections, but I'm going to be working on a novel later this year.
Hello, I'm Sam Te Kani, and that's my collection of short erotic fiction. Pronouns he, him. I'm here in Auckland. I don't know what I'm working on at the moment. I'm imploding. Yeah, that's it.
Kia ora, ko Takunda Muzondiwa no Timua Wiaho. My name is Takunda Muzondiwa. I am a Zimbabwean spoken word poet. So yeah, poetry is my field of artistry, and my pronouns are she, her.
I don't have a book for you, Takunda, but you are included in this new book, which has just come out. So everyone should check that out. Thank you. So let's jump straight into it. So one of the title characters in Rebecca's novel, Greta and Volden, says at one point, "We met at a house party and he was very excited to meet someone else Russian, even though it's one of my many identities I don't feel I fit in properly with." So I wanted to start today by asking the panel about how their own personal journey with embracing or untangling their many own identities has impacted on their lives and their writing. So maybe we could start with you, Rebecca, seeing as I've just ripped that quote from your novel.
I don't remember writing that. Sorry, I don't know. I'm sorry, what was the question? What's your relationship with
these
being?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that like almost every identity that I have is not really visible. Like I don't really look like a queer person. People sometimes think that I am not Māori. Sometimes people think that I'm like different ethnicities. Like they think that I am Middle Eastern or, you know, things like that. When I lived in Germany, people would always be disappointed that I couldn't speak Turkish because they thought that I'd like lost my mother tongue. But you know, you're like, oh, I'm Māori. This means nothing to anyone. Yeah, I don't know, like.
So your comment about how sometimes, you know, those different identities are invisible to the outside world. Did you ever feel yourself needing to amplify a certain part of yourself to express it?
I don't feel like I need to, but I think sometimes, yeah, it's one of those things that like in yourself, I'm like, I don't need to do this. Like, I don't need to amplify any identity to like feel content with it. But then like I have like these other things, like you know, I get left off lists of Māori writers and stuff all the time because my you know, my book title is in English, my name is in English, my book isn't in the Kino colors, so people think that it's like a Pākehā book. I don't know, that kind of stuff happens to me all the time, and like you know, I'm so over it, but also, you know, like what can I do?
Do you feel that there is an internal need from your perspective to express that in a certain way so that people actually do get it?
No, yeah, that's what I mean. Like, I don't feel like I have to, but I want everyone else to sort themselves out.
What about you, Rose? Do you think, I mean, your name is very clearly on your book, but do you ever feel like you need to do things in a certain way to make it clear about who you are and what your multiple identities are?
Yeah, I think with, I guess, like other sort of second generation Chinese people or Asian people, it's quite obvious. Like if you are of that sort of group, you know how you navigate your cultural space and then like the Pākehā spaces that we're in or like other spaces. I think where it sort of comes, like, not that it's a problem, but like I think it's really easy to be read as like one thing or the other. And I think people are really, really have an idea of a binary. So like people will either come up to me and be like, oh, like you're Chinese, but you're not like Chinese. You're like a Chinese New Zealander because you speak really good English. And I'm like, well, it's not really like an either or, but people always seem to like want to have a really like simplistic model of people's identities, even though like in this country, like so many people hold multiple identities. But I think, especially with, to generalize, like I think with Pākehā who perhaps do not have like different worlds that they move through regularly, like this idea of like being multiple things in one space is like kind of unfamiliar to them. So like I often find that sometimes it's easier for people to like understand me if they can put me in one box rather than others. And I've just gotten to the point where I'm just like, whatever. Like this is that's obviously your issue and not mine. Like, so yeah. I'm just like, oh, thank you. Yes, I do speak great English and I have lived here forever. I'm glad that I'm like, you know, Pākehā passing in like a cultural way to you, but like, yeah.
And what about you? So have you ever felt yourself being put into a particular box as a writer or a creative because of your identities or who you are?
Me?
Yes.
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, it's obviously my shit's pretty gay. It's pretty gay. I kind of feel like I don't know. I feel like there is this sort of felt expectation if you preface yourself as like a Māori writer to do certain things or go to certain places, which I don't know, on some level I feel like I'm inherently failing at or whatever. But maybe only because like there is like a cultural imagination of what Māoritanga is and isn't. I don't necessarily think that I am actively subscribing to that, but then on another level, I'm kind of like, well, I am Māori, so whatever I do is fucking Māori, you know what I mean? Yeah, I think the only, outside of writing, the most concrete example I can think of my identities forming a nexus and a very specific commitment was when my high school forced me to be a prefect because I was both gay and brown. I was like, no, please, I don't want to do this. And they're like, no, you're going to do it. Outside of that, I feel like I'm at liberty to do what I want, and it's not too much. There's not too much negotiation going on where identity is concerned.
Yep.
That's all I have. I've got nothing else. I also just feel like we're in a climate where, you know, social media kind of forces everyone to be really positional by default. Like that's how you operate. That's how we operate, and it's like anything is preferable to uncertainty. So there's like a certain pressure to like make yourself coherent. That can sometimes be like counterintuitive or you know, make conflicts of interest, things like that. So there's like maybe an impatience or a lack of public capacity to sort of navigate intersectionality in a way that actually reflects reality, whatever that is.
Takunda, what's been your experience with navigating multiple identities and how they are perceived by others in the world?
I think our identities sort of exist in two spaces, that of our own self-perception and then the objectives perceptions of other people. And I think in my experiences, understanding all the multiple identities that exist within me, I understand that there's sort of a hierarchical order to how they're placed. So no matter where I'm placed in the world, when I enter a room, I know that I'm always Black before anything else. I'm always going to be Black, perceived as Black before I'm perceived as female. I'm always going to be perceived as Black before I'm perceived as queer. And that's objectively the identity that I identify with, that sits at the top of other people's self-perception, and then therefore my perception of myself, because it's how I interact with the world around me. And understanding how my role in trying to name or give understanding to what that means in a society that tries to put labels to what that identity is. So I think in a lot of my poetry, that's probably quite telling, that a lot of my poetry is about Africanism, Pan-Africanism, living in a Black world and a white, living as a Black person in a white world, and wanting to be the first person to be able to speak to that before the world is able to speak its own perceptions of what that is, because they don't know what that experience is. And I think it's interesting in the world that we live in today, of people speaking of multiple cultural identities that exist within them. But as a continental African, and we understand the colonial history that predates that in my existence today, we understand that there's a lot of history that exists within my lineage of people. And I'm sure if I was to go back into my genealogy, there's a lot of probably some point of European or Pākehā ancestry that exists there. But when I walk into a room, that is not the thing that you can identify, and therefore I don't have the proximity to that privilege and to be able to access the things that would grant me safety or some form of cultural advantage. So being able to identify that and understand what that means in terms of my safety, in terms of the safety of the people that I care about, in terms of how I'm interacting with other people. I think being confident and also while well read and intelligent about what my own identity is and what that's going to mean in terms of my interactions with the outside world, has been good for understanding and feeling as though I can sit well within my own body, but also knowing how I want and how I can dictate how other people should perceive me, and what I can do to facilitate their improved understanding of that.
Your comment about hierarchy got me thinking about how you're absolutely right. You know, there is different ways we are perceived, but certain identities will be seen first because of particular markers. So I wanted to ask all of you, you know, how do you switch between those different identities or markers depending on a different context? So if you're walking into different rooms, how do you sort of navigate moving between those based on the people that are in that room? And anyone can jump in.
Sometimes I will gay it up on the street if there's a cop, because I feel like I'm more visible as like a Māori man, you know, and then I'll neutralize the threat by being more femme, you know, like don't worry, I may be a Māori man, but I'm also gay as shit, so it's chill. You know, that's all I had to add to that.
Yeah, I like the use of the word neutralize. Yeah, in that example.
I think probably a lot of immigrant communities in particular, the word that comes to mind with that question is probably code switching. There's a different manner in which I would speak to my parents than that to which I speak to people at uni, for example, and understanding how my natural way of speaking or culturally what feels natural to me is perceived as unintelligent or can have great social ramifications. So in that way, knowing how I can kōrero te reo Pākehā in a way that is advantageous as opposed to speaking in a way that my people have learned to navigate the English language. So yeah, that's probably the same for me, quite the same as Sam. That same, you knowing when you need to neutralize a certain part of yourself for your own
and being able to like deftly do it, you know, like being able to switch with like a sort of a rapid comprehension of what's required from you in a particularly loaded moment or whatever. Funny that that's so, the sense of that is so like body centric, you know, like and all coming down to like as you see, Chris, like markers.
I think with being like Asian and like since I'm East Asian, like I guess like there's so much conflation between Chinese and Asian, and I think people forget that there's so many people from other parts of Asia in New Zealand. So there's like a certain privilege with being East Asian, and I guess there's been some like really interesting writing from American Asians kind of like critiquing the fact that, you know, that there is no Asian American identity because it's such a diverse group. And I kind of feel the same about Asian New Zealanders. Like I really strongly identify as a Chinese New Zealander, but whenever the sort of umbrella of Asian is kind of trotted out, I'm just like, this absolutely means nothing. And even like in the years between, so my parents, we immigrated here in 1996, comparing like the conditions and the types of people that could immigrate in that time to like the Chinese immigrants that come now, there is still just like so much disparity between those groups as well. And so I find that a really weird thing to navigate because particularly in Wellington, because there are less Asian people here, you know, like you give your fellow Asian person a nod on the street because you know that there's not that many of them. But then whenever I go to bloody Auckland, I'm just like, holy shit, like the pack and say
Wellington.
Parents' house has box toys. Pardon?
Wellington's as white as the driven snow. It's crazy.
Parts
it
of
can be in some parts, right? Yeah. I think the heart is a lot better, but like it's because I live in central Wellington and it is just like very, very white sometimes, and you do just Asian, especially like when I cycle home, there's always this like Asian, like an older Asian couple walking, and I always give them the nod because I'm like, we're like grandparents, you know. So it's really different, and I think I find it really situational because like in Auckland, my parents, who, you know, they've been here for almost, you know, about 25 years, they've found it hard to make Chinese friends because they're like, whoa, like we are much more Kiwi than them, even though to like the average Pākehā person, my parents aren't very Kiwi passing at all. But I mean, they just, because China changed so much in that time, they just have nothing in common with like more contemporary migrants either. So I think it's this interesting thing that like, I think, yes, like as on like a macro level, I'm like, see my fellow Asian, give them a nod, but on like a micro level, I also know that there's just like so much nuance and when people came and what situations they came in, that it sometimes feels a bit like meaningless to me. Yeah.
That you mentioned nuance, and before you said, you know, everybody basically has multiple identities, but there are some who don't engage with that idea. So I wanted to ask, do you think intersectionality is generally understood by the general public?
In like a Tumblr, Twitter, 160 character way, you know, like everyone's like, do you know what I mean? Everyone's got their like pithy sound bites so they don't look like an asshole when you ask them on the street. But I don't really think many people like stop and unpack it for their everyday. And I mean, like if it's doesn't come up for them, I can see why they don't engage with it.
Do you think it's because people are more comfortable in what might be a dominant identity, and then they sort of can seek shelter within that, and they don't feel the need to have to express those other parts of themselves?
Yeah, or like I think also it's kind of like, I guess like for me, like being Chinese and also queer, like this is back to what you were saying about hierarchies, Takunda. It's like it's interesting to be like, how do people read me, and that makes me respond, but then also what is my like relative, like how important are these relative things to me that I feel like I need to express them in a way that is like more visible to other people. And so like I guess, and like, you know, like I have queer friends who are just like very quiet about it, and they, you know, when they're not at the Pride parade with their little flags, just like, you know, like how what's that Australian comedian that talks about she just wants to stay at home and drinks cup of tea, and she's not really like out at the festival queer. Like there's lots of people like that as well, and I think it's fine to like have these multiple identities and just like not want them to be at the forefront all of the time, and it doesn't like mean that they don't matter to you, but maybe it's just, I feel like there's like an identity that you personally hold, but then there's also like identities that you perform to other people, and they're not necessarily the same all of the time. Because when you perform an identity, I think you kind of do have to conform to what like a cultural norm of what that identity looks like. So like, I'm like, yeah, love dumplings, love to speak Mandarin, you know, like, whereas I don't really, to me, being Chinese is not really about that, but for other people to understand that, I think you got to present a kind of like basic version of that. Or like what you were saying, Sam, about being like gay it up on the street, like there are like certain ways that you show those things, but they might not, but there are other ways to express that people won't read them in the same way.
And it's like, it's hard, something that's quite difficult to talk about in abstraction, because I feel like it, you know, as Takunda said, code switching is about, you know, specific and embodied contexts where you're making like, you know, rapid tiny decisions to give oxygen to this and to, you know, occlude that, blah, blah, blah. And then you were just talking about performing certain identities, Rose, and it's like, well, in different situations you can have different reasons or different motivations for performing certain parts of yourself, like turning the volume up on something, turning the volume down on something. I mean, like I was talking about, you know, assuming a more femme sort of gay, you know, in front of a cop, so I don't look like such a threat, that type of thing. Like it's not something I would, you know, think about too much before actually doing it. It's just this rapid, effective thing, you know.
And on this topic of performance, so Rebecca, in your book, you know, you've got characters who are Māori and Russian, Spanish and queer, and Scottish and queer, but at various times the characters wonder whether they're queer enough, or they're told that they're not Scottish enough. So yeah, what was your motivation for creating this cast of characters that inhabited all of these multiple identities?
I don't know, I guess like I don't like to write about myself, and I don't really like to put my own identity like into my fiction, but also like I can't stop being myself. So I guess when I think of a person, I don't think of a person who has like one single identity. Like I think that would be really like difficult for me to come up with. So yeah, I think that when you're thinking of a character, you just have to, you know, like come up with so many different aspects of their life, and then I guess not all of those generally like line up with each other in like a super traditional way, I guess, when I do it. Yeah.
And have you had much feedback from readers or people about being seen or represented in the way that you've portrayed certain characters in your book?
No, like I don't know, I get a lot of feedback like every day, but most of it is, you know, like it's, I don't know how to explain. It's I guess like I wrote this book like with a sort of intended audience of people, you know, who have multiple identities or whatever reading it, but then like the readership of all books is like the same, like, you know, it's, I don't want to get myself into trouble. You know, you get a lot, I mean, you get so many like older white people reading the book, and then they're responding being like, oh, she's like a little young cutie, like I hope that she keeps writing. And you're like, oh, I've like written this like super like complex book that is like really important to me, and like important in, I think, like for talking about identity. And then the responses I get are like, oh, like how old is she, 22? Like oh, she rushed the ending but she'll get better, like this kind of stuff. Or like, you know, it's not as good as this other book, but it's a fine read for a Saturday. Like, yeah, I kind of expected, and you know, like the book's like over 300 pages. There's like some stuff in there that I'm like, oh, I don't know, like if I should say this, if people are going to like be offended by whatever, or like is the book like too clean? Like, is there like not enough? Or like, you know, I had one review that was like, oh, from a straight white person who was like, oh, like it should have had more homophobia to be realistic. You know, stuff like that. So it's like, I think that, you know, as a writer, and I wrote this book like 3 years ago now, you're by yourself, like totally isolated, and you're like, oh, these are the like perceptions people are going to have of the characters and of me, and there's going to be like this kind of discussion, and they're going to like compare it to other Māori books and be like, oh, it's less Māori, or it's too gay, like it's unrealistic for this many people to be gay. And then like you get the actual response, and it's like, oh, like she's not as good as Sally Rooney, or like maybe when she's older, even though like me and Sally Rooney are the exact same age.
Who told you there should be more? Oh, sorry, I just wanted to.
No, you go.
Speak to Rebecca, being told that somebody said to you there should have been more homophobia in your book to make it believable, as if like that's a sort of like surface level expectation of the queer experience.
Yeah, definitely.
Resistance and violence.
Like, oh, like, yeah, like, oh, like the book is like a little, like, you know, like, because I didn't, like, for me writing the book, I was like, I don't want anything horrible to happen to these people, because every time I read, you know, like a queer book or a Māori book, something bad will happen to the people. And that's because bad things always happen to us, right? But I was like, what if I write a book where that doesn't happen? Like, you know, it's just one book. But then people kind of take that being like, oh, it's like light and like fluffy and stuff. Like it doesn't, I don't know if like we need to have, I don't know if we need to have hate crimes to like be counted as being like a serious writer.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Rant over.
Kind of what I was saying about the like performing identities is that even if you understand all it means for you personally to be like queer or Asian or Māori, but when you are read by a predominantly Pākehā audience, they have these fucking expectations, and anytime you fucking challenge them, they're just like, oh, that's unrealistic, or like, oh, that's not X enough, because they already have these like weird preconceived notions of what that is. And there's that whole thing of like, I kind of get the sense that like so many people are like, oh, I'll just read the one Māori book or the one Chinese book, or the one queer book, and then they kind of take it as the canon, even though like there is so much nuance to the story. And there are just going to be people who live fine lives and like maybe do not have anything traumatic that happened to them, and you can't really erase that from the Māori experience of the queer experience. But it's just this weird thing of like, oh, like even when you do have someone of their identity speaking their truth, there is still this weird mirror of, oh, but that's not what I thought it would be like, so you must be wrong, which is so weird. Like,
and I think with fiction as well, like there's obviously like some, you know, like it can be a completely like randomized gap between like the author's lived experience and what they've written, and then so you kind of also have people assuming what you're like from your fiction writing, and they're like, oh well, you know, you're rich, and I'm like, no. It's just nice to be like, oh, like, and they lived in a lovely big house, and but you don't have to. But then like 3 years later, people are like, oh, like, you know, are you really Māori? Like you live in this like house in Ringweta or something. You're like, no, I don't.
Yeah, the one bad review I've never forgotten about How to Be Dating Snakes was that the reviewer felt that it needed more of the white supremacist, which is like, no, that's totally not the point of the book.
What?
And it was just like, oh, never mind. But yeah, so this idea that queer or minority characters need some sort of trauma to be realistic is this, I guess, is a stereotype or this thing that people, certain readers expect from us. We've sort of touched upon it in terms of fiction, but Takunda, you know, how do you feel that relates to poetry?
Me being someone who exists in the realm of like competitive poetry, I completely understand that. It's almost become naturalistic and instinctual to me that if I'm going to a competition and the point there is to win, understanding that I'm performing in most of the time in front of a predominantly Pākehā audience, is that I have to wring out my traumas and speak of my traumas in order to win, because when queer people, Black people speak of our joys, that is not what wants to be heard, because that's not what is emotionally stimulating to people, which is extremely disheartening. But I think there is something so radical about us speaking about our joys. And I think many of our movements have been co-opted because we start to behave in ways in which a white world wants us to do. So it might seem that there's a benefit to me being like, oh, I could win this event as a Black queer person and be the first person to win this event. But how the means by which I got there was by meeting white demands. I didn't want to speak of my traumas. I didn't want to expel that and relive that. I would have much rather spoken of my joys, but that's not what gets me to the end point. And I think that's been a great learning for me, that the journey, if it isn't one that's crafted by me, it's working for white means, and therefore there's nothing radical about it. I have to be the dictator of my own life, as opposed to being the bystander and letting those demands then curate what I write or create or perform. Yeah.
And Sam, what's been your experience in terms of your own writing in crafting these narratives or these characters, and whether or not you incorporate trauma or pain or joy even in a way to sort of subvert that expectation?
Well, a lot of the pain in some of my stories is deeply eroticized. So, you know, and like a sadomasochistic sense. I'm thinking of like one story in particular in that collection where entering, like I'm finding taking pleasure in like the abject and transmuting abjection into something that is profoundly joyous is, I think that is maybe an unconscious angle that I repeatedly take, because that matches my experience and my own preferences, you know. Oh, I forgot what I was going to say. Also, my flat stinks. Someone's burning a tire outside or something. It's just coming in here. I might taste it. But also, like, in terms of what Takunda was talking about, like where, you know, trauma is suddenly this currency, you know, and you can like traffic it for gain. You can like literally, you know, kind of like, it comes down back to that code switching thing and what your motivations are for performing certain parts of yourself and turning the volume down on others. It's like, you can sort of read the room and know what you have to gain by, you know, doing this gesture or saying that thing, and you can fully game it, which is not, I mean, it's not as insidious as it sounds. I mean, a lot of the times, like, it's the shortcomings of language itself, you know, I mean, identity or how we sort of conceive of it, it's just like a shorthand for, you know, massive sprawling histories. And yet those are going to be necessarily reductive to do what they're meant to do, which is to facilitate communication, you know. So yeah. but that said, there are a lot of insidious sort of like, you know, systemic reductivisms that need to be constantly negotiated and renegotiated, which, you know, I mean, we're literally doing that right now and we're talking about it.
Yeah. While we're on this topic, we have a question that's come through for anyone to answer. What are some of your joys?
Anal.
Let's
just emphatically, I just can't stress that enough. You know, I'm done. That's it.
Rose, other than dumplings and noodles, what are your joys?
I'm just like massively into rock climbing at the moment. I'm just going to be like a psycho jock all the time.
Jock writers, damn you. Rebecca?
I don't know, friendship.
So awesome.
I can hear my friends cackling in the next room. And I like it when a new burger place opens in Auckland and then I go and eat the burger and then I'm like, you know, it's okay.
Also, even if it's underwhelming, it's still a joy.
Yeah, it's still a joy. It's still a joy to have an experience. I mean, like, you know, like living in the city, our experiences have become like very narrow.
Are you talking about Baby G? I love a Baby G burger.
I love Baby G. Oh no. Okay, I will tell this anecdote. I like named one of my characters like maybe like 10 years ago after like I was at like a theater festival and I just like liked one of the performers' names and I was like, oh, use that for my character, and then forgot that happened, you know, like 12 years later, like published this book and then forgot this was a real person who like is the founder of Baby G Burger.
You're talking about Greta.
Greta Gregory.
Yeah, Greta. Yeah, I love Greta.
Yeah,
right.
Well, she played a great Richard III in like 2008.
And now they own a burger place.
And now, owns an amazing burger. So great trajectory from the person.
Well, Baby G is really getting a solid plug right now. Oh my gosh. They're not even a sponsor. That's incredible.
All right, so we've had anal, rock climbing, burgers. Takunda, you're going to add to this very eclectic list.
I'll share two. Language learning is a joy because people are a joy and language learning is like an access to more people. And the feeling of when the lights go down in the cinema is a joy.
Oh, hard agree. Hard agree.
Yeah.
Oh, that's got me right here. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I wanted to, we've talked about sort of, you know, code switching based on different environments and contexts, but I did want to talk about the impact of place on how it affects, you know, how one forms your identity. Rose, in your book, you write about spending part of your youth in Whanganui as a time in your life that was a toilet stop that had gone on for too long. Sam, I think I read an interview where you talked about growing up in a small town in Takunda. You also lived in Taranaki for a while. How did growing up in these places influence the choices you made or the way that you expressed yourself?
Yeah, so I think what was really particularly jarring about Whanganui was that I had been in Auckland prior to that, and like specifically Mount Roskill, which is like one of the most diverse suburbs in Auckland, and also has a very high like Chinese and Indian population. So I was like in this environment where like everyone in my class was East Asian or Indian, and then suddenly at the tender age of 13 I was just like transported to that town of like 40,000 people, where it just felt like culturally I had gone back like 10 years, and people were just like saying shit that I was just like, whoa, this is the stuff that people used to say at primary school. I thought we were past this, but it was just a different cultural context. And it was just, yeah. And I used to have all this sort of like envy, I think, almost to like, so my old group of friends, because from Auckland, they all sort of stayed friends, and I see what they're up to on Facebook, and I'm like, whoa, like they just like do quite, I guess, like performative Asian things, like get bubble tea and stuff, and I'm just like, wow, they get to do these Asian things, whereas like Whanganui just like, I think still to this day does not have like a bubble tea shop. And even though I personally do not really like bubble tea that much, I'm just like, it's kind of weird, right? Like it's overpriced and sugary.
Chunky. I like my loads smooth, you know what I mean?
Exactly. Like when I do get it, I get the ones that are just like no milk and it's just tea and some fruit, but whatever. Bubble tea discourse aside, like I think when I was younger, I was a bit like envious of like my friends who were still in the big city, and they had these like Asian things, which were kind of just like commodities available in Asia. It's like kind of like going to China and be like, I miss McDonald's. Like, you know, that was sort of the equivalent of what they had. But I think in reflection, because I was in a environment where I was really different from everyone else, I sort of had to really understand who I was a lot more, because I think I was being a lot more challenged upon that. Whereas like my friend group in Mount Roskill, because they could just be like, oh, we're Chinese, we go have bubble tea, like that's kind of where their sort of understanding of that kind of stopped. And I think that there can be that sort of like shallowness sometimes in which we engage with like an identity that like is not the majority. And I think in some ways I am glad that growing up in a smaller town, I had to sort of unpack that a lot more for myself. And I think it was more confronting in some ways. But also I think I'm like, I don't know if I would have invested so much time in being like, what does it mean to me to be Chinese, if I hadn't really felt othered by my sort of environment.
Takunda, did you have a similar or different experience to that?
Living in Taranaki, where I lived like in a really small town of like, I want to say like 5,000 people in Inglewood, who all of which were like Pākehā. And there was absolutely no one who looked like anyone in my family.
Did you grow up in Inglewood, Takunda?
I did. Inglewood.
The place that has that weird high capita rate of murder, like the highest in Australasia.
Inglewood indeed.
Yeah, cursed.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We were talking about before the need to amplify certain parts of your identity, and I think it, in a lot of ways, living in such a white little town stunted my growth in a lot of ways as a Black person and as a queer person, in which, like I was saying before, in every room I walk into, that's what I am seen as first. And being like, that was like my family, basically fresh from Zimbabwe, where my English was still, you know, very much questionable, very much shocking, horrendous. And I had like short hair, like very, I guess that also goes into how Black women are hyper masculinized. So I was being perceived as the butch lesbian or whatever. That just my mere existence was already so amplified in those identities. So I've only ever existed knowing to try to minimize them as much as I could for my own safety, and trying to conform and belong as much as I could. And I think, yeah, so those two identities have very much always been like at the forefront of my existence, and there wouldn't be a conversation that would go by without someone needing to bring that up in some kind of microaggressive way. And now I suppose entering my adult life, where it's not something that I'm actively trying to minimize anymore, I just let it exist there and know that it's already at the forefront, has been a very, very healing process for me. But then also watching a lot of my friends who are straight passing or, you know, are not racially ambiguous and don't think that they look what society might deem that they should look like. It's been interesting watching them and how their behaviors, how they try to play those certain things. So I think it has been in my adult life a blessing in many ways that I feel very at home in my own body for those reasons. Yeah.
And Sam, you know, you've talked about in interviews about using literature and books as a means of escapism because of where you grew up. You know, and a lot of your stories do incorporate some sort of sci-fi or otherworldly element. Could you talk briefly about like how you use those modes or those genres to sort of unpack identity and privilege?
I mean, I'm definitely specifically thinking about my werewolf story, which is definitely based on whangare. Like, and if I think about it, weirdly allegorical of like the rage and shame around poverty and things like that, which I can say was intentional while I was writing it. I could say that, definitely not. But yeah, I definitely, growing up in a small town, which is pretty like Uber-esque or whatever. Obviously, the little homo kid was quite not ideal. Then I remember turning like 14 or something, being like, you know what, fuck it, you want gay, I'll give you gay, and just like became fucking monstrous. Like, I mean, all teenagers are monsters. They're barely human, you know what I mean? And they're on drugs, you know, secreted by their own personal body pharmacon or whatever. But I remember like me and my best friend and our other best friend, we were like, I mean, she wasn't even gay, but because she hung out with these two gay dudes, everyone was just like, she's the weird dyke. Like, and we just became so vicious and very shrill. And would like scream at people like, you're gonna die in this town, you cuck, like that type of thing, that type of like, you know, small town rage. And I definitely feel like that sort of set me up for this, I don't know, I just feel angry all the time. I should probably get therapy. Does that answer your question? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's great. And what about you, Rebecca? Did you ever feel that where you grew up had a particular effect on you figuring out who you were?
Yeah, like, I mean, I went to school in Mount Albert, which is next to Mount Roskill, so like everyone was Asian, just because I was like in the like top like girls class. So like you become this like this new minority where everyone's like, oh, you don't get it, you're not Asian, like you got to marry it, your parents are going to be fine with that, but that's an Asian fail, you don't get it, like this kind of stuff is like but I also like, as like an Aucklander, like when you like leave Auckland, suddenly you're like, oh god, like I'm too much of an Aucklander. Like you like drive down State Highway 1, you're like, I don't want to go in this shop, they're gonna know, and they're gonna think that we have COVID, and they're like gonna be weird about it. And I think that like, because my dad is from Morewa, like whenever I would go there, I would never think like, oh, I'm like not as Māori as like everyone else or whatever. I would be like, oh no, like I'm an Aucklander. Like that's how like the rest of the, you know, like the whānau or whatever would like perceive me as like an Auckland person who is like different from us. But yeah, I did. I'm not from a small town, so I can't speak to that.
But you've given an example of how
okay.
you were made to feel different, quote unquote. We are coming to the end of the session, and we do have one other question that I think I'll just throw into the mix. Who do you hope doesn't read your work and who do you really hope reads it?
I really didn't want my mum to give it a whirl, but she did.
And what was the response?
I think she got halfway through the first story and was like, no, absolutely not. But love you, Mum. It's actually my mum's birthday today. Happy birthday, Mum.
Happy
Birthday,
birthday.
Sam.
Or is it tomorrow? Oh my God, it could be tomorrow. Oh no, it's tomorrow because it's the same birthday as Rihanna.
Happy early birthday.
And we should all be lighting a candle for Rihanna tomorrow.
And playing birthday
Amen.
cake.
Amen. Our Lord and Savior.
Yeah.
Rose, I know that your parents have read some of your work.
Yeah, my parents were really stoked on my book, which I was a bit worried about because I never came out to my parents. I was just like, well, I'm in a long-term relationship with a man now. They don't need to know about my ex-girlfriend that we all went on holiday with to Thailand, and I just pretended that we were just friends, that we're going to go stay in a separate hotel. So once
Did they not pick up on anything?
we did not pick up on anything. So and I think it was because it was my dad that was with us. I think it was my mum, she might have picked up on something, but my dad, I think also with like with queer women, it's really it's really easy to erase romantic relationships into close friendships. And so my dad was like, yeah, sure, you go stay at the separate hotel from us with your friend. That's really normal. Girls' night, you know, like, so I never told them, but I wrote that scene in my book. And I remember coming across my parents reading the proof of my book and my mum pointing to a section and just being like, giving my dad this look. And I was just like, and this is how I come out to my parents. And then we never talked about it and nothing changed. And honestly, that is the most like ideal thing that has ever happened to me.
Takunda,
sorry.
Oh no, I was going to say, Takunda, your speech went viral. So clearly your parents must have known about it. But what about your other writing? What about your other performances?
I think I like to say, you know, queer people are always coming out. For the rest of our life, we will be coming out. But for me, my coming out was only ever important to my parents. Like that was like, as long as I came out to my parents, then I didn't give a fuck who else knew. And I remember when the speech went viral, like you can even see it now, like the comment section was like inundated with lots of people, I don't know, calling me a dyke. Oh my God, she's lesbian. Oh my God, she needs a straight man to like turn her around or whatever. And that was like at the end of, I think, high school. And I'm just being so stressed. And I would spend hours and hours and hours going through all of those comments, reporting them, because I was like, God forbid my parents see one of those comments and suddenly now they know, like, if they're going to find out, I really want it to be on my own terms, but I'd been struggling trying to tell them for 18 years. And I think my parents had seen one of the comments or someone had come to them in the street and said something. And they didn't tell me about that interaction until later, when I did tell them, like a year later or something like that. So at the time, I'd say definitely that was them who I didn't want them to, not that the comments were my works, but were my parents, that I didn't want them to ever look at my work, because I knew that it would come up somehow. And the flip side of that question of who I want to read my work would probably be just literally people who look like me, who exist like me. And I think I would have benefited from that. I think you find home in people who you not necessarily know, but you read something and something really like comforting and healing about knowing that someone experiences something similar to you and came out of it okay. Yeah.
Rebecca, you've touched on your readership earlier, but who do you hope actually does read your work?
Oh, I was going to say that my family thinks I'm straight. I don't know why.
You clearly need to amplify that part of yourself. Talk about anal at the dinner table. I don't know.
I mean, you know, you can like put out an incredibly gay book and give all these interviews and like just have like all your like social media bios just being like, I'm gay, and your family can just be like, but like in a straight way.
What?
Gay in a straight way.
Are you estranged from your family? Like, do you talk? What's the vibe?
We don't talk about what's going on with us. And I know my mom's not listening because she just drove up the driveway, so it's fine. Oh, what was I saying? Yeah, like I don't have anyone who I hope doesn't read the book. I kind of like it when you know, like some old straight guy reads the book and then like gives a 2-star Goodreads review being like, I hated it. What a horrible book. You're like, well, shame, you just spent like 5 hours reading this book.
The joke's on you.
And yeah, like obviously, like I hope people read my work who actually like it and like get something out of it and stuff, rather than, you know, people who kind of like read stuff because they like want to read 100 books a year or whatever.
Ugh.
Right, so that brings us to the end of our session today. This has been such a wonderful conversation. There's so much more we could have talked about, but unfortunately we are out of time. So thank you so much to Sam, Rose, Rebecca, and Takunda for joining us today. There are many, many more same sessions happening this afternoon, so please jump on the website to have a look. There's a link that Annie has posted in the chat. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a good day.
Thank you, Chris. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Chris.